In March of 1952, a chemical company employee stood at the edge of a buried canal in Niagara Falls, New York, with a drilling rig and an audience. The audience was a delegation from the local school board. The employee wasn't hiding anything from them. He was showing them something on purpose, driving borings down through several feet of clay in front of their own eyes, so there could be no confusion later about what was underneath their feet. What came up on the drill was chemical waste, thousands of tons of it, sealed under that clay for almost a decade. The school board watched this demonstration. Then, a little over a year later, they paid $1 for the land anyway, and built a school on top of it. Most people who know the name Love Canal know it as shorthand for a single idea. A company buried poison, and a community got sick. That much is true. But it leaves out the part of the story that is, in some ways, the most disturbing. Because it means this was never really a story about something hidden. Nobody snuck this past anyone. The company that buried the waste walked the buyer to the exact spot and showed them what was there before the sale went through. Somewhere in a New York deed office, there is still a legal document from 1953 with a single paragraph in it. A paragraph that describes exactly what was buried and exactly whose responsibility the company intended it never to be again. That paragraph did not stop a single shovel of dirt from being moved. We're going to find out why. In 1892, a businessman named William T. Love proposed digging a canal to connect the upper and lower sections of the Niagara River, generating hydroelectric power for a planned model city nearby. An economic depression ended the project before it produced a single kilowatt. What Love left behind was a shallow, unfinished ditch, roughly a mile long, 60 feet wide, that did nothing for decades except collect rainwater and the occasional swimming child from the neighborhood forming around it. In the 1920s, the city of Niagara Falls began using the abandoned ditch as a municipal dump. During the Second World War, the United States Army used it too, disposing of waste connected to wartime chemical production. Some accounts describe material tied to the Manhattan Project among it. In 1942, the Hooker Chemical Company purchased the 16-acre site outright, specifically to use as a private industrial waste disposal ground. The location suited the company's purposes almost perfectly. Isolated enough to draw no attention, close enough to Hooker's Niagara Falls plant to make hauling waste there cheap and routine. And already, thanks to 2 decades of municipal and military dumping, treated by the surrounding community as a place where nobody expected anything good to be buried. Over the next 11 years, the company added to what was already there, burying an estimated 21,000 tons of chemical waste, benzene, dioxin, PCBs, and dozens of other compounds sealed in steel drums, layered under repeated coats of clay. By 1953, the canal was full. Hooker capped it and stopped using it. The company now owned a sealed underground chemical graveyard in the middle of a rapidly growing American city, and a growing city, as it turned out, needed land for schools. The Niagara Falls School Board set its sights on the Hooker property. By its own later account, Hooker was reluctant to sell. The company knew precisely what was under that clay, and precisely what would happen if it was disturbed. That reluctance produced the scene from the beginning of this story. In March of 1952, a Hooker representative brought school board officials directly to the site and drilled test borings into the protective cap in front of them, pulling up physical evidence of the buried chemicals so there could be no claim later that nobody had been told. It did not change the school board's mind. In April of 1953, Hooker sold the 16 acres to the Niagara Falls Board of Education for $1. The deed included a clause, an exculpatory provision, stating plainly that the site had been filled with waste products from manufacturing and that the buyer assumed all risk and liability incident to the use thereof. The clause went further. No claim, suit, action, or demand of any nature whatsoever, it stated, should ever be made against Hooker for injury or death that might result from the buried chemicals. Read that again. A company sold land for the price of a cup of coffee. attached a written admission that it was full of poison, and asked the buyer to sign away, in advance, any right to ever hold them responsible for what that poison might do. The Board of Education signed. Then, months later, in August of 1953, after Hooker's own demonstration, after the deed's own warning, the board voted to remove 4,000 cubic yards of fill from the site to use in grading a different school property. The clay cap that had sealed the chemicals for a decade was breached by the very body that had just been warned, in writing and in person, not to disturb it. The 99th Street School opened on the site in 1955. Homes followed, ringing the old canal on every side, eventually close to 800 of them. Families moved in with no idea that the ground under their children's swing sets had a signed legal document somewhere describing it as a hazard. There is a detail in this part of the story that historians still argue over, and it's worth sitting with for a moment, because it cuts against the simplest version of the narrative. Some researchers have pointed out that under ordinary property law, a new owner becomes automatically responsible for hazards on land they purchase, whether or not a deed says so, meaning Hooker's clause was technically unnecessary to achieve what the company wanted. One interpretation is that Hooker inserted the warning anyway, specifically to make the danger unmistakable in writing, precisely so the company could not later be accused of concealment. If that was the intention, it did not work the way anyone at Hooker might have hoped. The paragraph meant to prove the company had warned everyone became, 26 years later, the single piece of paper that proved the company had known all along. For the next 2 decades, Love Canal functioned, on the surface, like any other post-war American neighborhood. Underneath, the clay cap kept eroding. Cracked by construction, by sewer lines the city ran through the property, by a highway project in the 1960s that rerouted streets directly across the old dump. Hooker was not in the dark about the danger during any of this. An internal company memorandum, dated June 18, 1958, 3 years after the school opened, documented children being burned by chemical materials exposed at Love Canal. That memo sat inside Hooker's own files for 21 years before it became public. Entered into the congressional record in 1979 by Representative Albert Gore of Tennessee, who argued that everything that followed had been avoidable if the company had acted on its own documented warning signs. Through the 1960s and into the 1970s, residents began reporting foul odors, strange residues in their basements, and gardens where nothing would grow properly. A state environmental investigator looking into toxic chemicals in Niagara County was aware, as early as 1976 and 77, of these complaints. Nothing about the underlying cause reached the residents themselves. They were simply living, as far as they knew, in an ordinary neighborhood with an unusual number of unexplained health problems. In the spring of 1978, a Niagara Falls resident named Lois Gibbs picked up a local newspaper and read a story that would change the rest of her life. It described roughly 20,000 tons of toxic chemicals buried 3 blocks from her home. The same chemicals, the article said, that were now seeping into nearby basements and yards. Gibbs had a personal reason to keep reading. Her son Michael, a student at the 99th Street School, had developed asthma, then pneumonia, then a urinary tract disorder, then a seizure disorder, a run of unexplained illness that no doctor had been able to fully account for. Her younger daughter had been diagnosed with a rare blood disease. Gibbs had no scientific background. She was, by her own description, a shy homemaker who avoided public speaking. She began asking her neighbors a simple question: was anyone else's child sick like this? Almost everyone she asked said yes. In March of 1978, even before Gibbs's own investigation began, the New York State Department of Health had started quietly collecting air and soil samples from basements around the canal and running a health study on nearby families. The early findings showed elevated rates of reproductive health problems and confirmed chemical contamination in the soil and air. That data existed before most residents had any idea a health study was even underway. In August of 1978, Gibbs turned her door-to-door questions into an organization, the Love Canal Homeowners Association, grown out of a smaller parents' group she had already started. Word moved through the neighborhood fast. Within 48 hours, several hundred families had joined. Within weeks, the association represented more than 90% of the households in the area. The stories residents brought to those early meetings were not abstract statistics. One mother stood up and said she had carried her child 9 months, and the baby had weighed 3 pounds, and it had been stillborn. Another described losing her daughter the same way and said she believed it was because of the chemicals and asked the officials in the room directly not to let it happen to anyone else. A young boy named John Allen Kenny, who had spent his summers swimming in a creek that ran behind his house, a creek fed by the same contaminated ground, died. Gibbs later described a chemical worker from the plant coming to her in private and breaking down in tears, a detail she found more unsettling than almost anything else, because she had never before seen that particular kind of man cry. On August 2, 1978, State Health Commissioner Robert Whalen declared a state of emergency. He ordered the 99th Street School closed, and then he did something that split the neighborhood in two. He ordered the evacuation of pregnant women and children under the age of 2, and left everyone else exactly where they were. Families with a toddler qualified to leave. Families whose children had just turned 3 did not. Neighbors who had been standing shoulder to shoulder in the same meetings, describing the same stillbirths and the same seizures, were suddenly sorted by the state into 2 different categories of risk, based on an arbitrary line that protected some of their children and not the others. People who lived across the street from each other, whose kids had grown up on the same swing sets and gotten sick from the same soil, found themselves on opposite sides of a decision made in Albany by officials who had never had to explain it to either family's face. 5 days later, on August 7th, President Jimmy Carter declared a federal emergency at Love Canal. The first time in American history a disaster caused by human activity, rather than a natural event, received that designation. Full relocation followed in stages over the following 2 years. By the time it was finished, somewhere between 833 and just over 900 households had been moved out, at an initial cost of roughly $10 million. Between October of 1978 and June of 1979, a congressional oversight subcommittee held 13 public hearings on Love Canal and took testimony from 106 witnesses. One of them was Elliot Lynch, the former chief chemist of the Niagara County Water District. He testified under oath that he had personally watched hooker trucks dump waste directly into the open canal, completely uncontained, not sealed in drums, not buried under clay, simply poured in, roughly 60 feet from the county's own water treatment plant. The hearings kept surfacing worse material. On April 11, 1979, Representative Gore read the 1958 burn memo into the record. 3 days later, new testing found dioxin levels at the site 100 times higher than previously reported. 2 days after that, a leaked 1975 internal hooker study, nicknamed, inside the company, Operation Bootstrap, became public, documenting unsafe working conditions, obsolete equipment, and years of chemical discharge from the plant directly into the air and into sewers that emptied into the Niagara River. By November, investigators had identified 200 tons of buried dioxin alone, and more than 200 separate chemical compounds in total. Called before the Senate to answer for all of it, Hooker's executive vice president, Bruce Davis, told lawmakers plainly that his company bore no legal liability for what had happened at Love Canal. The deed from 1953 said the same thing, in its own words, 26 years earlier. The story most people know about Love Canal ends with the evacuation. It doesn't actually end there. Through the 1980s, New York State conducted a lengthy habitability study of the wider evacuation zone, the roughly 800 homes that had been emptied, not just the small fenced core directly over the old landfill. In September of 1988, the State Health Commissioner determined that several of the outer neighborhoods met the criteria to be lived in again. Lois Gibbs, watching from a distance by then, called the plan a whitewash, and warned it was being pushed forward faster than the science justified. The state proceeded anyway. In 1990, the first new families moved back into homes on the northern edge of the old evacuation zone in a section renamed, deliberately, publicly, as a piece of marketing, Black Creek Village. Roughly 200 renovated houses were sold, at prices around 20% below the surrounding market, to buyers told the area was, in the words of the State Revitalization Agency's own director, possibly the most closely monitored piece of residential land in the country. A few years after the first families moved in, some of them began reporting miscarriages, rashes with no clear cause, the same categories of complaint that had emptied the neighborhood 12 years earlier. Officials responded the way officials had responded before. The monitoring wells showed nothing. The area was safe. There was no mechanism by which contamination could be reaching the new homes undetected. Whether Black Creek Village is actually safe remains, to this day, a subject environmental scientists and former residents do not fully agree on. What is not in dispute is the timeline. A company buried poison, sold the land with a written warning attached, watched a school get built on top of it, watched families get sick and leave, and then watched the state resell parts of that same land, one generation later, to a new set of families who were mostly too young to have heard the name Love Canal mean anything at all. The courts eventually disagreed with Bruce Davis. In the case that followed, United States versus Hooker Chemicals and Plastics Corporation, a federal court held that a company cannot sell away its responsibility for a public nuisance simply by writing a clause into a deed. The exculpatory language that Hooker had drafted so carefully in 1953 never actually protected the company the way it had intended. Separately, roughly 1,300 former Love Canal residents pursued their own civil claims against Occidental Chemical Corporation, the company that had absorbed Hooker, and against the city of Niagara Falls. After years of litigation, that case settled for $20 million. Divided among 1,300 families, it amounted to a modest sum per household for the kind of loss no settlement is really built to cover. A home abandoned, a neighborhood erased. In some cases, a child who did not survive to see any of it resolved. In October of 1980, Carter returned to Love Canal in person and signed the Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation, and Liability Act, the law that would become known permanently by its nickname, Superfund. It exists specifically so that a company can be forced to pay for a toxic site years or decades after it tries to walk away from one. It took until the mid-1990s for the money to actually arrive. In 1994 and 1995, Occidental Petroleum, the company that had absorbed Hooker, agreed to pay New York State and the federal government more than $225 million for cleanup and relocation costs. Not one individual Hooker executive was ever criminally charged for what happened at Love Canal. Not the men who signed the 1953 deed, not the ones who received the 1958 memo about burned children, not the ones who kept dumping into an uncontained canal 60 feet from a public water plant. Lois Gibbs, the shy homemaker who once avoided public speaking, is remembered today as the mother of Superfund. The law she helped force into existence has since been used against hundreds of other companies at other sites across the country, in her name and because of her testimony as much as anyone's. The 1958 memo, the 1952 demonstration in front of the school board. The deed clause meant to make sure nobody could ever ask Hooker to pay for what it had already, on paper, admitted was true. None of it was ever actually hidden. It was written down, witnessed, and signed. It just took 26 years, one newspaper article, and a mother asking her neighbors one simple question for anyone to go back and read it. Somewhere in Niagara Falls today, a family is putting their children to bed in a house in Black Creek Village, on streets that used to have different names, over ground that a company once drilled into on purpose, in front of witnesses, specifically to prove what was there.